They told her she wasn't FBI material. Too quiet, they said. Too analytical. Not assertive enough for federal law enforcement. But when Agent Derek Thornfield stood frozen in that Phoenix conference room, staring at the evidence board that had stumped his entire task force for 8 months, Elena Vasquez calmly opened her laptop and did something that would change everything. What happened next would force the FBI to question everything they thought they knew about criminal investigation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Elena Vasquez's modest Scottsdale apartment, casting geometric patterns across walls lined with financial charts and flowcharts that most people would find incomprehensible. At 34, Elena possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that often went unnoticed in crowded rooms but could unravel the most complex financial mysteries with surgical precision. Her small home office told the story of someone who lived and breathed numbers. 3 monitors displayed cascading spreadsheets, while printed reports covered every available surface in carefully organized stacks. This wasn't the workspace of someone playing at being a detective. This was the command center of a forensic accountant who had built her reputation one impossible case at a time. Elena's path to this moment had been anything but conventional. 5 years earlier, she had walked into the FBI recruitment office in Phoenix with stellar academic credentials, advanced degrees in both accounting and computer science, and recommendations from professors who called her analytical abilities extraordinary. She had dreamed of using her skills to fight financial crimes on a federal level, to take down the kind of sophisticated operations that local law enforcement couldn't touch. The rejection letter had been polite but devastating, not the right fit for field operations, lacking the assertive personality profile preferred for federal agents, better suited for support roles in private sector consulting. Elena had read those words dozens of times, each reading stinging more than the last. The FBI wanted agents who commanded rooms, who could intimidate suspects and take charge of chaotic situations. Elena's quiet, methodical approach didn't fit their mold. Instead of letting that rejection define her, Elena had built something entirely her own. She established a forensic accounting consultancy that specialized in cases other professionals deemed impossible. Her clients ranged from divorce attorneys tracking hidden assets to small businesses discovering employee embezzlement. Word of her uncanny ability to follow money trails through labyrinthine financial structures had spread throughout Arizona's legal community. Elena's approach was unlike anything taught in FBI training manuals. While traditional investigators relied on interviews, surveillance, and physical evidence, she could reconstruct entire criminal enterprises from nothing more than transaction records and timing patterns. She saw connections that others missed, patterns that emerged only after hours of meticulous analysis that would bore most people to tears. Her apartment reflected this obsessive attention to detail. Every case file was color-coded and cross-referenced. Her custom-built database contained thousands of shell company registrations, property transfers, and banking relationships that she had painstakingly compiled over years of independent research. What the FBI did with teams of agents and massive budgets, Elena accomplished alone with nothing but determination and an almost supernatural ability to see the forest for the trees. The irony wasn't lost on her that some of her most successful cases had involved cleaning up messes that federal agencies had initially fumbled. Local police departments had started quietly referring their most complex financial crimes to her after their own investigators hit dead ends. Elena never bragged about these successes, never sought publicity or recognition. She simply did the work, found the truth, and moved on to the next puzzle. This particular morning felt different, though Elena couldn't yet articulate why. She had been tracking something unusual for weeks, a pattern of financial movements that seemed to connect several of her unrelated cases. Small businesses across Arizona, Nevada, and Utah were reporting similar types of embezzlement, but the stolen funds were disappearing through identical routing systems that shouldn't have been accessible to random local criminals. Elena suspected she was looking at the edges of something much larger, something that required the kind of sophisticated coordination and resources that suggested organized criminal activity on a multi-state level, the type of case that should have been handled by federal authorities from the beginning. But Elena had learned not to trust federal authorities with her discoveries until she had built an ironclad case that even the most skeptical agent couldn't dismiss. Her laptop chimed with an incoming email from Maria Santos, a client whose small catering business had been victimized by what initially appeared to be simple employee theft. The message was brief but urgent. Elena, I found more transactions. These aren't from anyone who worked for me. Can you come in today? I think someone has been using my business to wash money. Elena's pulse quickened as she read the message. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for, a direct connection between the theft and the larger money laundering operation she suspected. Maria's catering company had been used as an unwitting conduit for cleaning dirty money, probably without Maria ever realizing what was happening under her nose. Within an hour, Elena was sitting across from Maria in the small office behind the catering kitchen, reviewing bank statements that confirmed her worst suspicions. Someone had indeed been using Maria's business accounts to process transactions that had nothing to do with catering services. The amounts were relatively small individually, but when Elena began calculating the total volume and frequency, the scope became staggering. How did you discover this? Elena asked, her fingers already flying across her laptop keyboard as she began building a new analysis spreadsheet. Maria looked exhausted. The kind of tired that comes from discovering your life's work has been violated by people you trusted. My accountant was preparing quarterly reports and noticed that our credit card processing volume was triple what our actual sales receipts showed. When we dug deeper, we found hundreds of transactions for services we never provided to customers we never served. Elena studied the transaction logs with growing excitement. This wasn't just money laundering. It was money laundering with a technological sophistication that suggested either inside knowledge of financial systems or access to resources that small-time criminals shouldn't possess. The timing intervals between transactions followed mathematical patterns that spoke to automated systems rather than manual processing. Maria, I need you to understand something, Elena said carefully. What happened to your business isn't isolated. I think you've been caught up in something much bigger. Something that probably involves dozens or maybe hundreds of businesses across multiple states. The people behind this aren't amateur criminals. They're professionals with significant resources and technical capabilities. Maria's face went pale. Are you saying I'm in danger? Elena considered this carefully before responding. I'm saying that what you've uncovered is potentially evidence of a major federal crime. This is the kind of operation that the FBI should be investigating, not a freelance accountant working out of her apartment. Even as Elena said these words, she felt the familiar sting of irony. The FBI that had deemed her unqualified for their ranks was now the agency that needed to handle the case she had been building for months. But Elena had learned something important in her 5 years of independent work. The truth didn't care about institutional politics or personal pride. If this case was as big as she suspected, it needed federal resources and authority to be properly prosecuted. That evening, Elena sat in her apartment surrounded by printouts and charts that mapped out what she was now certain was a sophisticated money laundering operation that spanned at least 3 states and involved hundreds of small businesses that had been compromised without their knowledge. The elegance of the scheme was almost beautiful in its complexity. Small amounts siphoned from multiple sources, cleaned through legitimate businesses, and consolidated into accounts that probably fed much larger criminal enterprises. Elena had seen enough federal cases from the outside to know that this discovery would eventually need to reach the FBI's attention. But she also knew that walking into their Phoenix field office as a rejected applicant, trying to hand them a solved case, would likely result in condescension at best and complete dismissal at worst. Federal agents had egos, and those egos didn't typically respond well to being shown up by civilians, especially civilians they had previously rejected. But Elena had something that most civilians didn't have when approaching federal law enforcement: a completely documented case with irrefutable evidence and a clear understanding of exactly how the crime was being committed. She wasn't coming to them with theories or suspicions. She was coming with proof. The next morning, Elena made a decision that would change the trajectory of both her career and the FBI's understanding of financial crime investigation. She picked up her phone and called the Phoenix FBI field office, asking to speak with whoever handled major financial crimes. After being transferred 3 times, she found herself speaking with Agent Derek Thornfield, a man whose voice carried the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told he wasn't qualified for anything. Agent Thornfield, my name is Elena Vasquez. I'm a forensic accountant here in Phoenix, and I believe I've uncovered evidence of a multi-state money laundering operation that your office should be investigating. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of Thornfield suppressing what might have been a sigh. Ms. Vasquez, we appreciate citizens bringing potential crimes to our attention, but financial crime investigation requires specialized training and federal resources. If you've discovered something suspicious, you're welcome to file a report with our white-collar crime unit. Elena had expected this response, but it still stung. Agent Thornfield, I'm not a concerned citizen who noticed something odd in her bank statement. I'm a licensed forensic accountant, with advanced degrees in accounting and computer science. I've been tracking this operation for months, and I have documentation that proves criminal activity involving businesses in Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. I'm sure you do, ma'am, Thornfield replied, his tone carrying the kind of patience that adults reserve for persistent children. But federal financial crime investigation involves complexities that civilian consultants typically don't understand. We have protocols and procedures that ensure evidence is gathered and analyzed according to federal standards. Elena felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice level. Agent Thornfield, what if I told you that I can prove this operation has processed over $12 million in the past 18 months alone, and that I can identify the specific accounts, shell companies, and routing systems they're using to clean the money? This time the pause was longer. $12 million? Thornfield's tone had shifted slightly, though he was clearly trying to maintain his dismissive posture. That's a very specific figure, Ms. Vasquez. It's specific because I've documented every transaction, Elena replied. I can show you exactly how they're doing it, which businesses they've compromised, and where the money goes after it's been cleaned. But more importantly, I can show you how to catch them. Elena could hear Thornfield consulting with someone else in the background, their voices too low to make out individual words. When he returned to the phone, his tone was slightly less condescending but still clearly skeptical. Ms. Vasquez, if you believe you have evidence of federal crimes, you're welcome to come in and present what you've found. I can meet with you tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Thank you, Elena said, already planning how to organize her evidence for maximum impact. I'll be there. After hanging up, Elena spent the rest of the day preparing what she privately called her shock and awe presentation. She had learned from previous encounters with skeptical clients that overwhelming evidence presented in an organized, undeniable format was the fastest way to overcome initial dismissal. Tomorrow, she would walk into the FBI field office not as a rejected applicant seeking validation, but as a professional investigator, presenting a solved case to colleagues who just happened to wear federal badges. Elena printed detailed transaction analyses, network diagrams showing the connections between compromised businesses, and timeline charts that demonstrated the operation's evolution over 18 months. She prepared copies of every document, organized them in color-coded folders, and rehearsed her presentation until she could deliver the key points without referring to notes. As she worked late into the night, Elena reflected on the strange path that had led her to this moment. The FBI's rejection had forced her to develop skills and perspectives that traditional federal training might never have provided. Working independently had taught her to build airtight cases without the luxury of federal resources or institutional backing. She had learned to be right the first time, every time, because she didn't have the authority to compel cooperation or the credibility that came with a federal badge. Tomorrow would test whether those hard-earned skills could stand up to federal scrutiny. Elena had no illusions about the reception she would receive from Agent Thornfield and his colleagues. She would be walking into their territory as an outsider trying to teach them about their own job. But Elena had learned something important in her years of independent work. The truth didn't care about territorial disputes or wounded egos. The evidence would speak for itself, and the evidence was overwhelming. Elena closed her laptop and looked around her apartment at the walls covered with financial charts and evidence boards. Tomorrow, she would find out whether the FBI was ready to listen to the woman they had once deemed unqualified for their ranks. More importantly, she would find out whether federal law enforcement was ready to confront the reality that sometimes the most important discoveries came from the people they had overlooked. The FBI field office in Phoenix occupied an imposing concrete and glass structure that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Elena parked her modest Honda Civic between two black SUVs in the visitor section, gathering her carefully organized evidence folders and laptop bag. The security checkpoint process took 20 minutes, during which Elena observed the steady flow of federal agents moving through the building with the purposeful efficiency that comes from knowing you belong somewhere. Agent Derek Thornfield met her in the sterile lobby exactly at 2 o'clock, his appearance matching his voice perfectly. Tall, immaculately groomed, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent, he possessed the kind of confident bearing that announced federal authority before he ever showed his credentials. His handshake was firm but brief, his smile professional but cold. "Ms. Vasquez, thank you for coming in," Thornfield said, gesturing toward the elevator bank. "I have to admit, I'm curious about these claims you've made regarding a $12 million money laundering operation." Elena followed him into the elevator, noting how his tone managed to convey both interest and skepticism simultaneously. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me, Agent Thornfield. I think you'll find the evidence compelling." The elevator rose silently to the 4th floor, opening onto a corridor lined with conference rooms and offices buzzing with activity. Elena caught glimpses of evidence boards, surveillance photos, and the kind of organized chaos that characterized active federal investigations. This was the world she had once dreamed of joining, the environment where she had imagined using her analytical skills to fight sophisticated financial crimes. Thornfield led her into a mid-sized conference room where 3 other agents were already seated around an oval table. The introduction process felt more like an examination than a professional courtesy. Agent Marcus Kellerman, a silver-haired veteran with shrewd eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Elena's appearance and demeanor. Agent Riley Patterson, younger and clearly eager to prove herself, already had her phone positioned to record the meeting. Agent Vincent Sterling, whose rumpled appearance and tired expression suggested someone who had seen too many civilian tips that led nowhere. "Gentlemen, Riley, this is Miss Elena Vasquez," Thornfield announced, gesturing for Elena to take the seat at the far end of the table. "She believes she's uncovered a major money laundering operation that we should be investigating." The seating arrangement was clearly deliberate, placing Elena at the opposite end from the agents, creating a subtle us-versus-them dynamic that made her feel like a suspect rather than a consultant. Elena opened her laptop and arranged her evidence folders with methodical precision, aware that every movement was being scrutinized and judged. "Ms. Vasquez," Agent Kellerman began, leaning back in his chair with arms crossed. "Agent Thornfield mentioned you work as a freelance forensic accountant. What kind of cases do you typically handle?" Elena recognized the question for what it was, an attempt to establish the limitations of her experience before she could present her findings. "I specialize in complex financial investigations, primarily involving hidden assets, embezzlement, and fraudulent business practices. My clients include law firms, insurance companies, and local law enforcement agencies who need assistance with cases that require advanced financial analysis." Agent Patterson looked up from her phone. "Local law enforcement? You mean like helping small-town police departments figure out petty theft cases?" The dismissive tone stung, but Elena maintained her composure. "I've assisted with cases ranging from multi-million-dollar divorce asset investigations to helping the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department track funding sources for drug trafficking operations. The complexity varies, but the analytical methods remain consistent." Agent Sterling shifted in his seat, clearly impatient to move past what he obviously considered irrelevant credentials. "Ms. Vasquez, why don't you tell us about this money laundering operation you think you've discovered? What makes you believe it's federal rather than local?" Elena opened her first evidence folder, removing a network diagram that illustrated the connections she had mapped between compromised businesses across 3 states. The operation spans Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, involving what I believe to be over 200 small businesses that have been used as unwitting conduits for cleaning dirty money. The scheme's sophistication and geographic scope clearly indicate organized criminal activity that crosses state lines. Thornfield leaned forward to examine the diagram, his expression skeptical. 200 businesses? That's a very specific number for something you've allegedly discovered working independently. Elena had anticipated this challenge. She opened her laptop and projected a spreadsheet onto the conference room's wall screen, displaying columns of data that represented months of meticulous research. "I've documented 197 confirmed businesses and identified patterns that suggest approximately 50 additional companies that are likely involved but require further investigation to confirm." The agents exchanged glances as they studied the data projection. Elena could see their skepticism beginning to crack as they absorbed the sheer volume of documentation she had compiled. This wasn't the work of an amateur detective with conspiracy theories. This was professional-grade analysis that would have impressed investigators in any federal agency. Agent Kellerman pointed at specific entries on the spreadsheet. How did you identify these businesses as connected? What's your methodology? Elena clicked through several screens, displaying transaction pattern analyses and timing correlations that revealed the operation structure. Each compromised business shows identical characteristics in their credit card processing anomalies. Transactions occur in specific dollar amounts at mathematically predictable intervals, always during hours when the businesses are closed, and the funds are routed through the same network of shell companies before disappearing into offshore accounts. Agent Patterson had stopped recording and was now taking notes by hand, her earlier dismissive attitude replaced by focused attention. You're saying these criminals have automated the money laundering process? Elena nodded, advancing to her next evidence slide. The sophistication level suggests either insider knowledge of financial processing systems or access to custom software designed specifically for this purpose. The timing patterns are too precise for manual operation, and the geographic distribution indicates a coordinated effort that required significant planning and resources. Agent Sterling leaned forward, studying the transaction data more closely. These amounts, they're all under $10,000. Standard anti-money laundering protocols wouldn't flag individual transactions of this size. Exactly, Elena confirmed. They're structuring the transactions to avoid federal reporting requirements while processing enormous volumes through multiple businesses simultaneously. When you aggregate the total volume across all compromised businesses, the operation is cleaning approximately $800,000 per month. Thornfield had been quietly reviewing Elena's printed documentation while she presented the electronic evidence. Ms. Vasquez, this level of analysis would typically require federal database access and surveillance resources that civilian consultants don't possess. How did you compile this information? Elena had prepared for this question, knowing it would challenge the fundamental assumptions about how financial crime investigations should be conducted. Agent Thornfield, most of this information is publicly available through state business registrations, property records, and court filings. The key is knowing how to identify patterns across multiple data sources and having the patience to manually cross-reference thousands of individual records. Agent Kellerman looked up from the evidence folders he had been examining. You did this manually? Without federal database access or automated analysis tools? Elena couldn't keep a hint of pride from her voice. I've spent 5 years building my own database of financial relationships, shell company networks, and property ownership patterns. When you work independently, you learn to be resourceful with the tools available to the public. The room fell silent as the agents absorbed the implications of what Elena was telling them. A civilian working alone had uncovered a major federal crime using nothing but persistence, analytical skill, and publicly available information. The sophistication of her analysis rivaled anything their own white-collar crime units produced, but she had accomplished it without federal authority, resources, or institutional support. Agent Patterson broke the silence. Ms. Vasquez, if you've identified this operation and documented its structure, why bring it to us now? Why not continue your investigation independently? Elena had wrestled with this question for weeks before making the decision to contact the FBI. Because stopping this operation requires federal authority and resources that I don't possess. I can document the crime, but I can't prosecute it. These criminals are stealing from hundreds of small business owners who have no idea their companies are being used to launder money. Every day this continues, more businesses are compromised and more stolen funds are cleaned. Thornfield closed the evidence folder he had been reviewing and looked directly at Elena. Ms. Vasquez, assuming your analysis is correct, and I'm not yet convinced it is, what makes you think we haven't already identified this operation through our own investigative methods? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Elena realized this was the moment when she would either gain their respect or confirm their initial skepticism. She opened a new file on her laptop, displaying a timeline that showed the operation's evolution over 18 months. Agent Thornfield, if the FBI was already investigating this operation, you would have shut down the shell companies I've identified and frozen the accounts where the cleaned money is being consolidated. According to corporate registrations I checked as recently as yesterday, all of these entities remain active and continue processing transactions. Agent Sterling's eyes widened as he studied the timeline. You've been monitoring their activity in real time? Elena nodded. I've developed automated alerts that notify me when new businesses register with the specific characteristics that indicate potential compromise. The operation is still expanding, adding approximately 5 new businesses each month according to the pattern analysis. Agent Kellerman stood and walked to the wall screen, studying Elena's data projection more closely. This is extraordinary work, Ms. Vasquez. The level of detail and the scope of your analysis is frankly impressive. He paused, then turned back to face her. But it's also concerning that a civilian has uncovered this operation while federal agencies apparently missed it entirely. Elena recognized the defensive undertone in Kellerman's comment. Federal agents didn't like being shown up by outsiders, especially when those outsiders had been previously rejected by their own recruitment process. Agent Kellerman, I'm not here to criticize federal investigative methods. I'm here because I believe this case requires federal prosecution, and I want to see these criminals stopped. Thornfield had been unusually quiet during the latter part of Elena's presentation, but now he leaned forward with an expression that suggested he was reassessing his initial dismissal of her claims. Ms. Vasquez, let's assume for a moment that your analysis is accurate. What would you recommend as the next investigative steps? Elena had prepared for this question, knowing that her credibility would ultimately depend on her ability to provide actionable intelligence, rather than just impressive documentation. The operation's weakness is its reliance on legitimate businesses for money laundering. If you could coordinate with state banking regulators to simultaneously freeze the accounts of the shell companies I've identified, you would trap whatever funds are currently in the system and force the criminals to reveal themselves by attempting to access frozen assets. Agent Patterson looked up from her notes. Simultaneous action across 3 states would require significant coordination and federal authority. Elena nodded. Which is exactly why I brought this to the FBI, rather than trying to handle it through local law enforcement. This is a federal case that requires federal resources. Agent Sterling had been quietly reviewing Elena's transaction analyses while the conversation continued. Ms. Vasquez, these patterns you've identified, the timing intervals and amount structures, they're remarkably consistent across different geographic regions. That level of coordination suggests either a single controlling organization or multiple organizations using identical methodologies. Elena advanced to her final evidence slide, displaying a network diagram that showed the ultimate destinations of the cleaned money. Agent Sterling, I believe it's a single organization with sophisticated operational procedures. The cleaned funds from all 3 states are consolidated into accounts, controlled by a holding company registered in Delaware. From there, the money disappears into offshore jurisdictions that don't cooperate with U.S. financial investigations. Thornfield stood and walked around the conference table to study Elena's evidence more closely. You've traced the money all the way to offshore accounts? Elena shook her head. I've traced it to the point where it leaves U.S. jurisdiction. Following it beyond that would require federal authority and international cooperation agreements that I obviously don't have access to. The agents exchanged meaningful glances, and Elena could sense a shift in the room's dynamic. Her presentation had progressed from curious skepticism to grudging respect, but she detected something else in their expressions, something that looked like embarrassment or frustration that they had missed such a significant criminal operation. Agent Kellerman returned to his seat and opened a notebook that he had not consulted during the entire meeting. Ms. Vasquez, I have to ask you a direct question. Have you shared this information with any other law enforcement agencies or federal offices? Elena understood the implication behind the question. If she had already presented this case to other agencies, the Phoenix FBI office would look incompetent for not having discovered it independently. No, Agent Kellerman. I contacted Agent Thornfield directly because Phoenix is where I first identified the pattern, and this office has jurisdiction over the Arizona businesses that are being compromised. Agent Patterson had been unusually quiet during the latter part of the meeting, but now she looked up from her notes with an expression of professional curiosity. Ms. Vasquez, can I ask why you originally applied to join the FBI? What made you interested in federal law enforcement? The question caught Elena off guard, forcing her to confront the professional disappointment that had shaped the last 5 years of her career. I wanted to use my analytical skills to fight sophisticated financial crimes that were beyond the scope of local law enforcement. I believed that federal agencies offered the best opportunity to make a meaningful impact against organized criminal operations. Thornfield's expression suggested he was connecting dots that he perhaps should have connected earlier. Ms. Vasquez, when did you apply to join the FBI? Elena hesitated, knowing that revealing the timeline would expose the irony of her current situation. Approximately 5 years ago, I was interviewed by the Phoenix recruitment office and ultimately determined to be unsuitable for federal agent positions. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Elena could see the agents processing the implications. A woman they had rejected for lacking the proper qualifications was now sitting in their conference room presenting a solved federal case that their own investigators had missed entirely. Agent Sterling was the first to break the uncomfortable silence. Ms. Vasquez, what specific reasons were you given for the rejection? Elena had memorized every word of that rejection letter, and the sting of those criticisms had motivated her through 5 years of building her independent practice. The recruitment office determined that I lacked the assertive personality profile preferred for federal agents and would be better suited for support roles in private sector consulting. Agent Kellerman closed his notebook with more force than necessary. I see. And now you've independently uncovered a major federal crime that our own white-collar crime unit missed. Elena recognized the frustration in Kellerman's voice, but she also heard something else. Respect for what she had accomplished despite their institutional rejection. Agent Kellerman, I'm not here to relitigate personnel decisions from 5 years ago. I'm here because I've discovered criminal activity that needs to be stopped, and stopping it requires federal authority. Thornfield had been studying Elena's offshore account analysis while the conversation continued around him. Ms. Vasquez, this Delaware holding company that's consolidating the cleaned money, have you been able to identify its actual ownership or control structure? Elena opened a new file that contained her most recent discoveries. The holding company is controlled by another shell company registered in Wyoming, which is in turn controlled by a trust registered in South Dakota. The beneficial ownership is hidden behind multiple layers of legal entities, but I've identified some potential connections to individuals with prior federal convictions for financial crimes. Agent Patterson's pen stopped moving across her notepad. You've connected this operation to known criminals? Elena nodded, advancing to a slide that showed photographs and criminal history summaries for 3 individuals. These connections are tentative and would require federal investigative resources to confirm, but the pattern suggests this operation may be the work of experienced money launderers who have previously been prosecuted by federal agencies. The agents stared at the photographs, and Elena could see recognition dawning on several faces. These were not random criminals. These were individuals who were apparently already known to federal law enforcement, which meant Elena had potentially uncovered not just a new crime but the renewed criminal activity of previously convicted felons. Agent Thornfield stood and walked to the window, overlooking the Phoenix skyline. Ms. Vasquez, if your analysis is correct, this represents a significant failure of our post-conviction monitoring systems. These individuals should have been flagged for suspicious financial activity. Elena had considered this possibility during her analysis, but had avoided mentioning it to avoid appearing to criticize federal procedures. Agent Thornfield, my analysis suggests these individuals have learned from their previous prosecutions and have developed more sophisticated methods for avoiding detection. The automation and geographic distribution of this operation indicates they've studied federal investigative procedures and designed their crimes to exploit weaknesses in interagency coordination. The room fell silent again as the agents absorbed the full implications of what Elena was telling them. She had not only uncovered a major federal crime but had identified experienced criminals who were apparently using their knowledge of federal investigative procedures to commit more sophisticated versions of their previous offenses. Agent Sterling looked up from the criminal history summaries Elena had provided. Ms. Vasquez, how long did it take you to develop this analysis? Elena consulted her notebook to provide an accurate timeline. I first noticed the patterns approximately 8 months ago while working on individual embezzlement cases for clients. I began dedicated investigation of the broader operation about 6 months ago, and I've been monitoring it full-time for the past 3 months. Agent Kellerman shook his head in apparent disbelief. 6 months of dedicated investigation, working alone, without federal resources or database access. Elena nodded. Agent Kellerman, when you work independently, You learn to be thorough because you don't get second chances. I couldn't afford to present incomplete analysis or unsubstantiated theories. Thornfield returned to the conference table and sat down heavily, his earlier confidence replaced by what appeared to be professional frustration, mixed with reluctant admiration. Ms. Vasquez, I have to admit that your analysis is far more comprehensive than anything our white-collar crime unit has produced recently. The level of detail and the scope of your investigation is frankly embarrassing for a federal agency that should have identified this operation months ago. Elena recognized that Thornfield's admission represented a significant shift in how the agents viewed both her capabilities and their own investigative procedures. Agent Thornfield, I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I'm here because I believe this case requires immediate federal action, and I want to provide whatever assistance might be helpful in stopping these criminals. Agent Patterson had been quietly reviewing Elena's evidence folders while the conversation continued. Ms. Vasquez, this automated monitoring system you've developed for tracking new businesses, could it be adapted for federal use? Elena had not expected this question, but it opened possibilities she had not previously considered. Agent Patterson, the system I've built is designed around publicly available data sources and pattern recognition algorithms that could theoretically be scaled up for federal monitoring purposes. But it would require significant computing resources and database integration that individual consultants can't afford. Agent Sterling leaned forward with renewed interest. You're saying the FBI could potentially use your methodologies to identify similar operations before they reach this scale? Elena nodded enthusiastically. Agent Sterling, the patterns I have identified are probably characteristic of sophisticated money laundering operations in general. With federal database access and sufficient computing power, similar analysis could potentially flag criminal operations in their early stages, rather than after they've been running for 18 months. The agents exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that Elena represented more than just a source of information about a single case. Her analytical methods and technological approaches could potentially revolutionize how federal agencies approached financial crime investigation. Thornfield consulted his watch and stood up. Ms. Vasquez, this has been an extremely productive meeting. I think we need to arrange for you to present this analysis to our white-collar crime task force, and potentially to federal prosecutors who would handle the case. Elena began gathering her evidence folders, feeling both relief and anticipation. Agent Thornfield, I'm available whenever would be most convenient for the task force. This operation is continuing to expand, so time is probably a critical factor. Agent Kellerman stood and extended his hand to Elena. Ms. Vasquez, I want to apologize for our initial skepticism. Your analysis is exceptional, and frankly, it's the kind of investigative work that federal agencies should be producing internally. Elena shook his hand, noting that his grip was firm and his expression genuinely respectful. Agent Kellerman, skepticism is appropriate when civilians approach federal agencies with claims about major crimes. I understand that you encounter a lot of people who think they've discovered criminal conspiracies. Agent Patterson gathered her notes and looked up at Elena. Ms. Vasquez, can I ask what you plan to do after this case is resolved? Will you continue working as an independent consultant? The question forced Elena to confront possibilities she had not allowed herself to consider. Agent Patterson, I haven't thought beyond ensuring this operation is stopped and the criminals are prosecuted. I suppose I'll continue with my consulting practice unless other opportunities arise. Thornfield had been organizing Elena's evidence folders and now handed them back to her. Ms. Vasquez, I think opportunities may indeed arise. Your analytical capabilities and investigative methods are exactly what federal agencies need for fighting sophisticated financial crimes. Elena accepted the folders, noting that Thornfield's tone had completely transformed from the dismissive professionalism of their initial phone conversation. Agent Thornfield, I appreciate your consideration of my work. My priority is seeing this case through to successful prosecution. As the agents escorted Elena back to the elevator, she reflected on how dramatically the meeting had exceeded her expectations. She had walked into the FBI field office expecting to face skeptical federal agents who would reluctantly accept her evidence while questioning her qualifications. Instead, she had found professionals who recognized exceptional work regardless of its source, and who seemed genuinely interested in learning from her analytical methods. The elevator descended toward the lobby, and Elena realized that her relationship with federal law enforcement was about to change in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. The woman who had been rejected by the FBI 5 years ago was now being courted by the same agency that had once deemed her unsuitable for their ranks. But Elena also understood that the real test was still ahead. Presenting evidence to federal agents was one thing. Proving that evidence could lead to successful prosecutions would require her to work within federal systems and procedures that she had only observed from the outside. The next phase would determine whether her independent analytical methods could translate into federal investigative success. The following Tuesday morning arrived with an unexpected phone call that would push Elena into territory she had never navigated. Agent Thornfield's voice carried an urgency that hadn't been present during their previous conversations, immediately putting Elena on high alert as she balanced her phone against her shoulder while reviewing client files at her kitchen table. "Ms. Vasquez, we need you to come in immediately," Thornfield said without preamble. "The task force has reviewed your analysis, and we have a situation that requires your immediate expertise." Elena glanced at her calendar, noting the 3 client meetings she would need to reschedule. "What kind of situation, Agent Thornfield?" There was a pause that suggested Thornfield was choosing his words carefully. "The criminals you identified have apparently detected some kind of law enforcement interest. They've accelerated their timeline and are attempting to extract the maximum amount of money from the system before shutting down the operation entirely." Elena's blood ran cold as she absorbed the implications. "How much money are we talking about?" "Based on the patterns you identified, our analysts estimate they're trying to clean approximately $4 million over the next 72 hours before disappearing completely," Thornfield replied. "Ms. Vasquez, if we don't stop this extraction, these criminals will walk away with enough money to restart their operation anywhere in the world." Elena was already reaching for her laptop bag and car keys before Thornfield finished speaking. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. The FBI field office buzzed with an energy Elena hadn't witnessed during her previous visit. Agents moved through corridors with purpose, phones rang constantly, and the conference rooms she passed were filled with intense discussions over evidence boards and computer screens. Elena followed Thornfield through this controlled chaos to a large command center she hadn't seen before, where multiple wall-mounted displays showed real-time financial data streams and geographic maps dotted with colored indicators. Agent Kellerman stood at the center of the room, coordinating what appeared to be a multi-jurisdictional operation that involved not just FBI personnel, but representatives from state banking regulators, federal prosecutors, and law enforcement agencies from Nevada and Utah. The scale of the response confirmed that Elena's analysis had triggered the kind of federal investigation she had dreamed of being part of 5 years earlier. "Ms. Vasquez," Kellerman called out as soon as he spotted her entering the command center. "Thank you for coming in on short notice. We have a significant problem that requires your analytical expertise." Elena approached the central workstation where Agent Patterson was monitoring multiple computer screens displaying transaction flows that Elena immediately recognized as her money laundering network. "What's changed since our meeting last week?" Patterson gestured at one of the displays showing transaction volumes that were dramatically higher than Elena's historical data indicated. "Yesterday morning, the operation went into overdrive. Transaction volumes increased by over 300%, and they're processing money through businesses we hadn't previously identified as compromised." Elena studied the data streams, her mind automatically beginning to identify patterns and anomalies that suggested the criminals had shifted to an emergency extraction protocol. "They know we're coming," she said quietly. Agent Sterling looked up from a conversation with what appeared to be federal prosecutors. "Ms. Vasquez, that's our assessment as well. The question is how they became aware of law enforcement interest and whether we can still intercept the money before it disappears offshore." Elena moved closer to the transaction monitoring displays, her analytical instincts fully engaged despite the pressure of the situation. "Agent Patterson, can you show me the geographic distribution of these new transactions? I need to see if they're following the same routing patterns or if they've switched to backup systems." Patterson's fingers flew across her keyboard, generating new displays that mapped the emergency transactions across the 3-state area. Elena studied the patterns with growing concern, recognizing that the criminals had indeed switched to backup systems that were even more sophisticated than their primary operation. "This is bad," Elena murmured, more to herself than to the agents around her. Thornfield moved to stand behind Elena as she analyzed the new data. "How bad, Ms. Vasquez?" Elena pointed at specific transaction clusters on the geographic display. They've activated what appears to be a completely separate network of compromised businesses. These aren't the same companies I identified in my original analysis. This is a backup system they kept in reserve for exactly this kind of emergency. Agent Kellerman joined them at the workstation, his expression grim. You're saying they have multiple money laundering networks running simultaneously? Elena nodded, her mind racing through the implications. Agent Kellerman, the sophistication level we're seeing suggests these aren't opportunistic criminals who stumbled into money laundering. This is a professional organization with redundant systems, emergency protocols, and operational security procedures that rival anything you'd see in legitimate financial institutions. The command center fell silent as the agents absorbed Elena's assessment. If she was correct, they weren't dealing with a simple money laundering operation, but with a criminal enterprise that had planned for federal investigation and prepared multiple escape routes. Agent Sterling approached the group with a phone pressed against his ear, clearly receiving updates from field agents or other agencies. Ms. Vasquez, our Nevada office reports that several businesses in Las Vegas are showing the same sudden increase in transaction activity. Whatever timeline these criminals are operating on, it's coordinated across all 3 states. Elena studied the real-time transaction data with growing urgency. Agent Sterling, based on the volume and velocity of these transactions, I estimate they can extract and clean the $4 million you mentioned in less than 48 hours rather than the 72 hours we initially calculated. Thornfield cursed under his breath. Ms. Vasquez, is there any way to predict which businesses they'll target next? Can we get ahead of this extraction process? Elena had been hoping someone would ask that question, because it represented the one area where her analytical methods might provide a crucial advantage over traditional federal investigative approaches. Agent Thornfield, I can't predict exactly which businesses they'll target, but I can identify the characteristics that make businesses attractive for emergency money laundering. Agent Patterson looked up from her monitoring screens. What kind of characteristics? Elena moved to a whiteboard at the front of the command center and began sketching a diagram that illustrated the criminal decision-making process she had identified through months of pattern analysis. Businesses that are targeted for emergency laundering need to meet specific criteria: high-volume credit card processing capabilities, minimal owner oversight of daily transactions, and geographic proximity to major transportation hubs that facilitate rapid movement of physical assets. Agent Kellerman studied Elena's diagram with interest. You're saying they choose businesses based on operational logistics rather than just opportunity? Elena nodded enthusiastically. Agent Kellerman, these criminals are operating like a sophisticated business. They evaluate potential targets based on risk-reward calculations, operational efficiency, and contingency planning. If we can think like they think, we can anticipate their next moves. Agent Sterling had finished his phone conversation and rejoined the group around Elena's whiteboard. Ms. Vasquez, if you can identify the characteristics they're looking for, can you generate a list of likely target businesses? Elena considered this request carefully, knowing that her answer would determine whether the FBI could intercept the money extraction or watch helplessly as millions of dollars disappeared into offshore accounts. Agent Sterling, I can generate a probability-ranked list of businesses that meet their targeting criteria. But I'll need access to commercial databases and geographic information systems that I don't have as an independent consultant. Agent Patterson was already pulling up database access screens on her workstation. Ms. Vasquez, what specific data do you need? Elena moved to Patterson's workstation and began navigating through federal database systems that represented capabilities she had envied for 5 years. I need business registration data for all 3 states, credit card processing volume information from merchant services companies, and geographic analysis tools that can map proximity relationships to transportation infrastructure. For the next 2 hours, Elena worked with an intensity that impressed even the veteran federal agents around her. She combined her analytical methodologies with federal database resources to generate predictive models that identified the most likely targets for the criminal's emergency extraction operation. The work required her to synthesize enormous amounts of disparate information while maintaining awareness of the time pressure that threatened to let millions of dollars escape federal jurisdiction. Agent Thornfield coordinated with field agents who were positioning surveillance teams at the businesses Elena identified as highest probability targets. Ms. Vasquez, your analysis has given us 12 businesses across the 3 states that meet the criteria you've identified. If you're correct, we should see suspicious transaction activity at these locations within the next 24 hours. Elena studied the deployment map that showed federal agents positioned near each target business. Agent Thornfield, I have to emphasize that this is predictive analysis based on pattern recognition. There's a possibility that these criminals have targeting criteria I haven't identified, or that they've changed their operational procedures in response to perceived law enforcement pressure. Agent Kellerman had been monitoring communications with the federal prosecutors who would ultimately need to authorize arrests and asset seizures. Ms. Vasquez, the U.S. Attorney's Office is asking for your assessment of the evidence we'll need to secure convictions against these individuals. They want to know if your analysis can support federal prosecutions. Elena had been anticipating this question since her first meeting with the FBI, knowing that her unconventional investigative methods would eventually need to meet federal evidentiary standards. Agent Kellerman, my analysis provides a roadmap for where to look and what to look for, but successful prosecutions will require the kind of physical evidence and witness testimony that only federal agents can legally obtain. Agent Sterling looked up from a conversation with banking regulators. Ms. Vasquez, what you're saying is that your analysis gets us to the front door, but we still need to do traditional investigative work to build prosecutable cases? Elena nodded. Agent Sterling, exactly. I can show you the criminal network structure and predict their behavior, but proving criminal intent and establishing legal culpability requires federal investigative authority that I don't possess. The distinction Elena was drawing highlighted a crucial limitation of civilian investigative work, even when that work was performed at the highest professional levels. Federal prosecutions required evidence that met strict legal standards, evidence that could only be obtained through official law enforcement procedures. Agent Patterson had been monitoring the real-time transaction feeds while Elena worked on target prediction. Ms. Vasquez, we're seeing new activity at 3 of the businesses you identified as high-probability targets. Transaction volumes are spiking exactly as your analysis predicted. Elena felt a surge of professional satisfaction mixed with anxiety about the criminals who were still actively stealing money while federal agents watched. Agent Patterson, how quickly can field agents move to intercept those transactions? Thornfield was already coordinating with field teams through his headset. Ms. Vasquez, we have agents moving to those locations now, but we face a tactical problem. If we move too early, we might not have sufficient evidence for arrests. If we move too late, the money disappears offshore. Elena understood the dilemma perfectly. Federal agents needed to balance the competing demands of evidence gathering and asset recovery, while Elena's analytical approach focused solely on stopping the criminal activity, regardless of prosecutorial considerations. Agent Thornfield, Elena said carefully, what if there was a way to disrupt their operation without immediately revealing federal law enforcement involvement? Agent Kellerman looked up with interest. What do you mean, Ms. Vasquez? Elena moved back to the whiteboard and began sketching a new diagram that illustrated the money laundering network's technological vulnerabilities. These criminals are using automated systems to process transactions through compromised businesses. If we could disrupt their automation without physically arresting anyone, we might be able to trap money in the system while they scramble to figure out what went wrong. Agent Sterling studied Elena's new diagram with growing excitement. You're talking about cyber disruption rather than traditional arrests? Elena nodded. Agent Sterling, their entire operation depends on seamless electronic processing. If key components of their system suddenly became unreliable, they would need to either slow down their extraction or risk losing money to technical failures. Agent Patterson looked up from her transaction monitoring. Ms. Vasquez, do you know enough about their technical systems to suggest specific disruption points? Elena had been hoping someone would ask that question because it represented an area where her unconventional background provided insights that traditional federal training might miss. Agent Patterson, I've been reverse engineering their automation based on transaction patterns and timing analysis. I believe I can identify the critical system components that, if disrupted, would force them to revert to manual processing that would slow their extraction by at least 70%. The command center erupted in excited conversations as agents realized that Elena might have provided them with a way to buy time for traditional investigative work while preventing the immediate loss of millions of dollars. Agent Thornfield removed his headset and approached Elena with an expression of intense focus. Ms. Vasquez, if we could implement the disruptions you're suggesting, how much additional time would that give us to build prosecutable cases? Elena consulted her analysis notes, calculating the operational impacts of various disruption scenarios. Agent Thornfield, if we could force them back to manual processing, I estimate it would take them at least a week to extract the $4 million rather than the 48 hours they're currently planning. That should provide sufficient time for federal agents to gather evidence and coordinate with international authorities to freeze offshore accounts. Agent Kellerman had been listening to Elena's proposal with growing enthusiasm. Ms. Vasquez, you're essentially suggesting that we fight technology with technology, rather than trying to intercept a fast-moving operation through traditional surveillance and arrests. Elena nodded. Agent Kellerman, these criminals have planned for federal investigation using traditional methods. They probably haven't planned for federal agents who understand their technology well enough to disrupt it systematically. Agent Sterling consulted his watch and looked around the command center with an expression of decision. Ms. Vasquez, we need to brief the task force leadership on your proposal immediately. If we're going to implement technological disruption, we need authorization from federal prosecutors and coordination with cybercrime specialists. Elena gathered her analysis materials, feeling both excitement and trepidation about the path the investigation was taking. Agent Sterling, I should mention that implementing these disruptions will require technical capabilities that go beyond my analytical expertise. I can identify the targets, but actually disrupting their systems will require federal cybercrime resources. Agent Patterson stood and began organizing her monitoring equipment. Ms. Vasquez, the Bureau has cybercrime specialists who can implement technical disruptions once they understand the targets and methodologies. Your analysis provides the intelligence they need to be effective. As Elena followed the agents toward what she assumed would be a briefing with senior FBI leadership, she reflected on how dramatically her role in the investigation had evolved. She had begun as a civilian consultant, providing analysis of criminal activity she had discovered independently. Now she was helping design federal operational strategies that combined traditional law enforcement with technological disruption in ways that challenged conventional approaches to financial crime investigation. The elevator carried them toward the upper floors of the FBI building, where Elena would face federal officials whose authority and experience dwarfed anything she had encountered in her independent consulting practice. These would be career federal agents and prosecutors who had spent decades building and trying complex criminal cases, and they would be evaluating proposals from a woman who had been rejected by their own recruitment process 5 years earlier. Agent Thornfield seemed to sense Elena's apprehension as they approached the executive conference room. Ms. Vasquez, I want you to understand that the officials you're about to meet are results-oriented professionals. They don't care about your background or how you developed your expertise. They care about whether your analysis can help them stop sophisticated criminals and recover stolen money. Elena nodded, but she also understood that her unconventional background would inevitably influence how senior federal officials perceived her recommendations. She was about to propose operational strategies to people who had never worked outside federal law enforcement systems. People who might view civilian expertise with skepticism regardless of its demonstrated effectiveness. The conference room they entered was larger and more formal than the spaces Elena had previously experienced in the FBI building. A dozen senior agents and federal prosecutors were already assembled around a polished oak table, reviewing documents and consulting with aides who moved between workstations displaying real-time operational data. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen looked up as Elena entered with the task force agents. Ms. Vasquez, thank you for joining us. Agent Thornfield has briefed us on your analysis and your proposal for disrupting this money laundering operation through technological means rather than immediate arrests. Elena took the seat indicated at the conference table, acutely aware that she was the only civilian in a room full of federal officials whose combined experience represented centuries of law enforcement and prosecution work. Ms. Chen, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss operational options. My analysis suggests that traditional investigative approaches might not be fast enough to prevent the loss of millions of dollars to offshore jurisdictions. FBI Assistant Director Michael Torres leaned forward with an expression of polite skepticism. Ms. Vasquez, Agent Thornfield tells us that you've identified this criminal operation through independent analysis and that you've developed proposals for disrupting their activities. Can you summarize your recommendations for the senior leadership team? Elena opened her laptop and projected her analysis onto the conference room's wall screens, displaying the network diagrams and operational flowcharts that represented months of intensive investigation. Assistant Director Torres, These criminals are using sophisticated automated systems to launder money through hundreds of compromised businesses across 3 states. Traditional arrests and asset seizures might stop some of the activity, but the automation allows them to extract millions of dollars faster than agents can physically respond to individual locations. Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen studied Elena's projections with interest. Ms. Vasquez, you're suggesting that we need to attack their technological capabilities rather than just arresting individual participants? Elena nodded. Ms. Chen, exactly. If we can disrupt the automation that enables high-speed money processing, we can force them to slow down their extraction enough for federal agents to intercept the money and gather evidence for successful prosecutions. Assistant Director Torres consulted notes that had apparently been prepared by the task force agents. Ms. Vasquez, this technological disruption you're proposing, would it require federal cybercrime capabilities that go beyond traditional financial investigation? Elena had been preparing for this question since developing her proposal. Assistant Director Torres, the disruption would require cybercrime expertise to implement, but the targeting intelligence comes from financial analysis that identifies the critical system components. It's a combination of financial investigation and technological intervention. The senior officials exchanged glances that suggested they were evaluating not just Elena's proposal but the broader implications of accepting strategic advice from a civilian consultant who had apparently out-analyzed their own financial crime specialists. Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen leaned back in her chair with an expression of careful consideration. Ms. Vasquez, let me ask you a direct question. In your professional opinion, what are the risks of implementing technological disruption versus the risks of proceeding with traditional arrests and asset seizures? Elena had considered this question extensively while developing her recommendations, knowing that federal officials would need to evaluate all operational risks before authorizing unconventional approaches. Ms. Chen, traditional approaches risk losing millions of dollars to offshore accounts if the criminals complete their extraction before agents can intercept the money. Technological disruption risks alerting the criminals to federal capabilities they might not have anticipated, but it also provides the best opportunity to trap money in systems where federal authorities can seize it. Assistant Director Torres stood and walked to the wall screens displaying Elena's analysis. Ms. Vasquez, your assessment assumes that these criminals haven't prepared contingencies for technological disruption. What if they have backup systems that we can't identify or disrupt? Elena acknowledged the validity of Torres's concern while maintaining confidence in her analysis. Assistant Director Torres, that's certainly possible. But my analysis suggests that their backup systems are less automated and therefore slower than their primary operation. Even if they successfully switch to manual processing, that buys federal agents time to coordinate seizures and arrests across multiple jurisdictions. The room fell silent as the senior officials considered Elena's response. Elena realized that she had reached the crucial moment when federal leadership would either accept her recommendations and authorize unconventional operational approaches, or revert to traditional investigative methods that might allow millions of dollars to escape federal jurisdiction. Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen consulted with FBI leadership through whispered conversations that Elena couldn't overhear. When Chen looked up again, her expression suggested that decisions had been reached. Ms. Vasquez, we're prepared to authorize technological disruption operations based on your analysis, but we need your continued involvement to ensure that our cybercrime specialists target the right systems and understand the operational impacts of their interventions. Elena felt a surge of professional validation mixed with anxiety about the enormous responsibility she was accepting. Ms. Chen, I'm honored by your confidence and prepared to provide whatever assistance might be helpful. Assistant Director Torres returned to his seat with an expression of stern authority. Ms. Vasquez, I want you to understand that you'll be working directly with federal cybercrime specialists and operational commanders who will be implementing strategies based on your intelligence. The success or failure of this operation will reflect on your analytical accuracy and your understanding of these criminals' capabilities. Elena met Torres's gaze steadily, recognizing that she was accepting responsibility for operational outcomes that could affect millions of dollars and multiple federal prosecutions. Assistant Director Torres, I understand the responsibility and I'm confident in my analysis. These criminals are sophisticated, but their sophistication creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited if we understand their systems well enough. As the senior officials began discussing implementation timelines and resource allocation, Elena realized that her journey from rejected FBI applicant to key federal consultant was about to enter its most challenging phase. The next 72 hours would determine whether her unconventional analytical methods could translate into successful federal operations against criminals who had evaded traditional law enforcement for months. The FBI Cybercrime Division operated from a secured floor that Elena had never imagined existed during her recruitment interviews 5 years earlier. Agent Jennifer Walsh, the lead cyber specialist, guided Elena through corridors lined with servers and monitoring stations that hummed with the constant activity of digital surveillance and electronic countermeasures. The scale of technological capability surrounding Elena dwarfed anything she had envisioned during her years of independent analysis. "Ms. Vasquez," Agent Walsh said as they approached a workstation cluster, where 3 specialists were already preparing for the technological assault Elena had proposed. "I have to admit that your approach to disrupting automated financial systems is unlike anything we've implemented before. Most cyber operations focus on infiltrating networks or stealing information, but you're proposing precision disruption that stops criminal activity without destroying evidence." Elena studied the array of monitors displaying network traffic analysis, transaction flow diagrams, and system architecture maps that the cyber specialists had compiled based on her intelligence. "Agent Walsh, these criminals have built their operation around efficiency and automation. If we can introduce strategic inefficiencies at critical processing points, we can force them to make mistakes that expose their methods and trap their money in systems where federal authority can reach it." Agent David Kumar, a specialist whose expertise in financial network analysis had earned him recognition throughout federal law enforcement, looked up from a workstation where he was mapping the technological targets Elena had identified. "Ms. Vasquez, the sophistication level you've described suggests these criminals have access to banking system knowledge that typically comes from insider sources or previous employment in financial institutions. Are we dealing with white-collar criminals who have turned their legitimate expertise toward illegal purposes?" Elena had considered this possibility extensively during her months of analysis, recognizing that the operational sophistication she observed exceeded what street-level criminals could typically achieve. "Agent Kumar, that's my assessment as well. The automation protocols and system integration I've documented require knowledge of banking procedures and software platforms that suggest either current or former employment in financial services." Agent Walsh activated a secure communications link that connected the Phoenix cybercrime team with federal offices in Las Vegas and Salt Lake City, creating a coordinated command structure that could implement technological disruption across the 3-state operational area. "Ms. Vasquez, we're about to begin the most complex financial system disruption operation in Bureau history. Your intelligence will guide our targeting, but once we begin, the criminals will know that federal authorities understand their technology well enough to attack it systematically." Elena understood the implications of what Agent Walsh was describing. Once the FBI demonstrated technological countermeasures against the money laundering automation, the criminals would know that their operational security had been completely compromised. They would either accelerate their extraction efforts or abandon the operation entirely, making the next few hours critical for recovering stolen money and gathering evidence for prosecutions. Agent Kumar's workstation displayed real-time transaction monitoring that showed the criminals' automated systems continuing to process enormous volumes of money through compromised businesses across all 3 states. "Ms. Vasquez, based on current transaction velocity, we estimate they'll complete their $4 million extraction in approximately 36 hours unless we intervene immediately." Elena moved to Kumar's workstation and began analyzing the transaction patterns with an intensity that impressed even the veteran cyber specialists. "Agent Kumar, I'm seeing subtle changes in their processing rhythms that suggest they're preparing to switch to even faster extraction protocols. If I'm correct, they might complete the extraction in less than 24 hours. Agent Walsh consulted with her team leaders before turning back to Elena with an expression of decision. "Ms. Vasquez, we need to begin disruption operations immediately. Can you identify the priority targets that will have the maximum impact on their extraction capabilities?" Elena opened her laptop and began cross-referencing her financial analysis with the technical intelligence the cyber specialists had compiled. "Agent Walsh, their operation depends on 3 critical choke points where automated systems consolidate money from multiple businesses before routing it to offshore accounts. If we can disrupt processing at these consolidation points, we can trap money in domestic accounts where federal seizure authority applies. Agent Kumar highlighted the choke points Elena had identified on his network monitoring displays. Ms. Vasquez, these consolidation points are protected by sophisticated security protocols that will detect our intrusion attempts. Once we attack the first target, they'll know we're coming for the others. Elena had anticipated this tactical challenge while developing her disruption proposal. Agent Kumar. That's why we need to attack all 3 choke points simultaneously rather than sequentially. If we can coordinate precise timing across multiple targets, we can disrupt their entire consolidation process before they can implement countermeasures. Agent Walsh activated her communications headset and began coordinating with cyber specialists in Nevada and Utah. Phoenix team, we're implementing synchronized disruption at targets Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie at exactly 1400 hours. Ms. Vasquez will monitor financial impacts while Kumar tracks system responses. Elena felt her pulse accelerate as she realized that federal agents across 3 states were about to implement operational strategies based entirely on her analytical recommendations. If her understanding of the criminal's technology was incorrect, millions of dollars could escape federal jurisdiction while FBI resources were committed to ineffective countermeasures. Agent Kumar's fingers moved across his keyboard with practiced efficiency, preparing the intrusion tools that would attack the automated systems Elena had identified as critical vulnerabilities. Ms. Vasquez, I want you to understand that once we begin these attacks, there's no stopping the operational sequence. We'll either succeed in disrupting their extraction or alert them to federal capabilities that could compromise future investigations. Elena studied the countdown timer that Agent Walsh had activated on the command center's primary display. Agent Kumar, I'm confident in the target identification, but I want to emphasize that these criminals have demonstrated operational sophistication that exceeds typical financial crime organizations. They may have contingencies we haven't anticipated. Agent Walsh removed her headset and addressed the assembled cyber specialists with the authority of someone who had commanded complex federal operations throughout her career. Team, we have confirmation from Las Vegas and Salt Lake City that their cyber units are prepared for synchronized disruption. Ms. Vasquez has provided targeting intelligence that represents the best opportunity we'll have to intercept this money before it disappears offshore. Elena watched the synchronized countdown reach its final seconds, knowing that the next few minutes would validate or destroy her professional credibility with federal law enforcement. If the disruption succeeded, she would have demonstrated analytical capabilities that could revolutionize how federal agencies approached financial crime investigation. If it failed, she would be responsible for alerting sophisticated criminals to federal countermeasures while failing to prevent the theft of millions of dollars. At exactly 1400 hours, Agent Kumar initiated the first phase of the technological assault Elena had designed. His workstation displayed cascading data streams that represented the FBI's electronic intrusion into the automated systems that processed millions of dollars for criminal organizations. Similar attacks were occurring simultaneously in Nevada and Utah, creating a coordinated federal response that matched the criminals' multi-state operational scope. Elena monitored financial transaction flows on her laptop, watching for the disruptions that would indicate successful interference with the money laundering automation. For the first 30 seconds, transaction processing continued at normal volumes, suggesting that the criminals' security protocols were successfully defending against federal intrusion attempts. Then Elena's monitoring screens began showing the anomalies she had predicted. Transaction processing speeds, at the first consolidation point, dropped by 60%, as automated systems struggled to function normally while under cyber attack. Money that should have been flowing seamlessly toward offshore accounts began accumulating in domestic accounts where federal seizure procedures could intercept it. Agent Walsh, Elena called out with barely contained excitement. Disruption is working at Target Alpha. Processing speeds are down significantly, and money is backing up in accounts we can reach with federal warrants. Agent Kumar's workstation showed similar success at the second consolidation point, where automated systems had apparently shut down entirely rather than risk processing transactions while under attack. Ms. Vasquez, Target Bravo is offline completely. Whatever money was in their processing queue is now trapped in the system. Agent Walsh coordinated with her counterparts in Nevada and Utah, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a successful operation. Phoenix team, Las Vegas reports successful disruption at Target Charlie. All 3 consolidation points are either offline or operating at severely reduced capacity. Elena continued monitoring financial flows, documenting the operational impacts of the technological disruption she had proposed. Agent Walsh, based on current processing rates, the criminal's extraction timeline has increased from 24 hours to approximately 1 week. That should provide sufficient time for federal agents to coordinate seizures and arrests. Agent Kumar was analyzing system responses to determine how the criminals were reacting to the unexpected technological interference. Ms. Vasquez, we're seeing attempts to restart automated systems using what appear to be backup protocols. They're definitely aware that their operation is under attack, but they don't seem to understand the source or scope of the interference. Elena felt a surge of professional satisfaction as she realized that her analysis had provided federal agents with operational advantages the criminals hadn't anticipated. Agent Kumar, their backup protocols aren't designed for coordinated multi-point attacks. They've planned for individual system failures but not for simultaneous disruption across their entire network. Agent Walsh had been monitoring communications intercepts that revealed how the criminal organization was responding to the technological assault. Ms. Vasquez, we're intercepting increasingly frantic communications between criminal operatives who can't understand why their automated systems are failing simultaneously across 3 states. Elena studied the intercepted communications transcripts that Agent Walsh shared with her workstation. Agent Walsh, these communications confirm my assessment that we're dealing with a sophisticated organization with hierarchical command structure and specialized technical personnel. But their confusion about our countermeasures suggests they didn't anticipate federal agents with detailed knowledge of their automation systems. Agent Kumar had been analyzing the criminals' attempts to bypass the technological disruptions, providing Elena with insights into backup systems she hadn't previously identified. Ms. Vasquez, they're attempting to switch to manual processing procedures that bypass the consolidation points we've attacked. But manual processing is requiring significantly more time and personnel, exactly as your analysis predicted. Elena opened new monitoring screens to track the manual processing attempts Kumar had identified. Agent Kumar manual processing also creates additional evidence trails that federal investigators can follow. Every manual intervention requires human decisions and communications that leave digital and physical evidence. Agent Walsh consulted with senior FBI leadership through secure communications channels, providing updates on the operational success Elena's intelligence had enabled. Ms. Vasquez, Assistant Director Torres wants a real-time assessment of how much money we've trapped in domestic accounts through the disruption operation. Elena compiled transaction data from all 3 consolidation points, calculating the financial impact of the coordinated technological assault. Agent Walsh, preliminary analysis indicates we've trapped approximately $2.7 million in domestic accounts where federal seizure authority applies. The remaining money is either still in transit through compromised businesses or has already reached offshore jurisdictions. Agent Kumar looked up from his system monitoring with an expression of concern. Ms. Vasquez, we're seeing indications that the criminals are attempting to abandon their automated systems entirely and switch to completely manual extraction procedures. They're willing to accept much slower processing in exchange for avoiding further technological interference. Elena had anticipated this possibility while developing her disruption strategy, recognizing that sophisticated criminals would eventually adapt to federal countermeasures. Agent Kumar, that's actually favorable for federal law enforcement. Manual extraction requires physical presence at business locations, creating opportunities for surveillance, arrests, and evidence gathering that automated systems don't provide. Agent Walsh activated a secure video conference link with field agents who were positioned at businesses Elena had identified as likely targets for manual extraction attempts. Field teams, we're transitioning from cyber operations to traditional surveillance and interdiction. Ms. Vasquez has provided intelligence indicating that criminals will now need to physically visit business locations to complete their money extraction. Elena watched video feeds from surveillance teams positioned at 12 businesses across the 3-state area, knowing that her analytical predictions about criminal behavior were about to face their ultimate test. If her understanding of the criminals' operational procedures was accurate, they would be forced to send personnel to these locations within the next few hours. Agent Kumar's workstation displayed renewed activity as the criminals attempted to restart portions of their automated systems using different routing procedures. Ms. Vasquez, They're trying to reactivate automation through alternate pathways that bypass our disruption points. Should we expand our technological attacks to include these new routes? Elena considered Kumar's question carefully, weighing the tactical advantages of expanded cyber operations against the risk of revealing additional federal capabilities. Agent Kumar, I recommend monitoring the alternate routes but not attacking them immediately. If we can document their backup procedures while allowing limited transaction processing, we gather additional evidence while maintaining the operational pressure that forces them toward manual extraction. Agent Walsh had been coordinating with federal prosecutors who were preparing seizure warrants for the trapped money Elena's operation had identified. Ms. Vasquez, U.S. Attorney Chen reports that we have sufficient probable cause to freeze all accounts where money has accumulated due to the processing disruptions. That represents the largest single asset seizure in this district's history. Elena felt the satisfaction of knowing that her analytical work had directly prevented millions of dollars from reaching criminal organizations, but she also understood that asset seizure was only the first step toward successful prosecutions. Agent Walsh freezing the accounts prevents further money movement, but building cases against the individuals responsible will require the kind of evidence that only traditional investigative work can provide. Agent Kumar was analyzing network traffic that revealed how the criminal organization was adapting to the technological disruptions Elena had implemented. Ms. Vasquez, we're intercepting communications that suggest the criminals are preparing to abandon this operation entirely rather than risk further losses to federal countermeasures. They're discussing protocols for shutting down the network and dispersing personnel. Elena had been monitoring financial flows that might indicate organizational dissolution, recognizing that sophisticated criminals often prioritized operational security over short-term profits. Agent Kumar, if they're preparing to abandon the operation, they'll likely attempt one final extraction push to recover whatever money they can before disappearing completely. Agent Walsh consulted her watch and addressed the assembled cyber specialists with an air of urgency. Team, if Ms. Vasquez is correct about a final extraction attempt, we need to be prepared for the criminals to take significant risks in order to access trapped money. They may attempt physical intrusions at business locations or direct attacks on banking systems. Elena opened her threat assessment files, consulting analysis she had prepared for exactly this scenario. Agent Walsh, a final extraction attempt would likely focus on the businesses where the largest amounts of money are trapped. Based on transaction volumes, I can identify the 3 locations where they have the most financial incentive to take operational risks. Agent Kumar highlighted Elena's priority locations on the surveillance monitoring system, connecting her financial analysis with real-time field operations. Ms. Vasquez, we have teams positioned at all 3 locations you've identified. If criminal operatives attempt physical access, field agents will be ready for interdiction and arrests. Elena studied the surveillance video feeds, watching businesses that appeared completely normal to casual observers, but were actually focal points for a multi-million-dollar federal investigation. Agent Kumar, I want to emphasize that these criminals have demonstrated sophistication and planning that exceeds typical financial crime organizations. If they attempt physical extraction, they'll likely use methods that federal agents haven't encountered in previous cases. Agent Walsh had been receiving updates from field teams that indicated unusual activity at several target locations. Ms. Vasquez, Las Vegas reports suspicious vehicles conducting surveillance at 2 of the businesses you identified as high-priority targets. The criminals may be preparing for physical extraction attempts exactly as your analysis predicted. Elena felt a mixture of vindication and anxiety as she realized that her behavioral predictions about criminal responses were proving accurate in real-time federal operations. Agent Walsh, if they're conducting pre-operational surveillance, they're likely planning coordinated attempts at multiple locations to maximize money recovery while minimizing exposure time. Agent Kumar's monitoring systems were detecting renewed attempts to activate automated processing systems, suggesting that the criminals were trying to coordinate technological and physical approaches to money extraction. Ms. Vasquez, they're attempting to restart automation at the same time they're positioning personnel for physical operations. This suggests a final coordinated push to extract maximum money before abandoning the operation. Elena analyzed the timing patterns of the renewed automation attempts, recognizing operational signatures that revealed important information about the criminal organization's command structure. Agent Kumar, The coordination between technological and physical operations requires real-time communication and centralized command authority. The criminals have to be operating from a control center that's coordinating activities across 3 states. Agent Walsh immediately grasped the implications of Elena's observation. Ms. Vasquez, if we can identify their command center, we can potentially arrest the leadership responsible for directing this entire operation, rather than just individual operatives conducting extraction attempts. Elena opened new analysis screens that tracked communication patterns and operational timing across the criminal network. Agent Walsh, based on the coordination patterns I'm observing, the command center is likely located within a few hours' drive of Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Salt Lake City. The timing interval suggests they need to be able to reach any of the 3 operational areas quickly if problems arise. Agent Kumar began analyzing network traffic and communication intercepts to identify the geographic location Elena's analysis suggested. Ms. Vasquez, if you're correct about the command center location, that significantly limits the possible geographic areas we need to investigate. Elena consulted geographic analysis tools to map the intersection of travel times from the 3 major operational areas. Agent Kumar, based on travel time analysis, the command center is most likely located in either southeastern Nevada or southwestern Utah, probably within a 50-mile radius of the intersection of Interstate 15 and Interstate 70. Agent Walsh was already coordinating with field teams in Nevada and Utah to investigate the geographic area Elena had identified. Ms. Vasquez, your analysis has narrowed our search area from hundreds of thousands of square miles to approximately 2,000 square miles. That's a tremendous operational advantage. Elena continued analyzing communication patterns and operational timing to refine her geographic assessment. Agent Walsh, I'm seeing additional indicators that suggest the command center is probably located in a facility that provides both technological capabilities and operational security. They need high-speed internet access for system management, but also physical isolation from potential federal surveillance. Agent Kumar was correlating Elena's geographic analysis with federal databases of commercial properties and communication infrastructure. Ms. Vasquez, the characteristics you've described point toward industrial facilities or technology centers that combine high-speed network access with restricted physical access. Elena felt the familiar excitement of analytical breakthrough as patterns emerged from the data stream she was monitoring. Agent Kumar, I'm seeing operational signatures that suggest the command center is located in a facility that was specifically selected or modified for coordinating multi-state criminal operations. This isn't an improvised setup. It's a professional criminal infrastructure. Agent Walsh consulted with senior FBI leadership about the command center intelligence Elena had developed. Ms. Vasquez, Assistant Director Torres is authorizing immediate investigation of the geographic area you've identified. If we can locate and raid their command center, we can potentially arrest the entire leadership structure responsible for this operation. Elena realized that her analytical work had evolved from documenting a discovered crime to providing operational intelligence for active federal law enforcement operations. Agent Walsh, I want to emphasize that command center identification is based on pattern analysis and behavioral prediction. Physical confirmation will require traditional investigative work by federal agents with appropriate authority and resources. Agent Kumar's workstation was displaying real-time updates from field teams investigating the geographic area Elena had identified. Ms. Vasquez, Utah reports identifying 3 facilities in the target area that match the technological and security characteristics you've described. Field agents are preparing for simultaneous investigation of all 3 locations. Elena watched the operational countdown that would determine whether her analytical methods could translate into successful arrests of the criminal leadership responsible for stealing millions of dollars from American businesses. Agent Kumar, I'm confident in the geographic analysis, but I want to emphasize that these criminals have demonstrated operational sophistication that may include contingency plans for command center compromise. Agent Walsh had been monitoring communications intercepts that revealed increasing urgency in criminal communications as federal pressure intensified. Ms. Vasquez, intercepts suggest the criminals are aware that federal investigation is accelerating beyond their initial expectations. They may be preparing to abandon their command center and disperse to avoid arrests. Elena analyzed the timing of criminal communications, recognizing patterns that suggested imminent operational changes. Agent Walsh, based on communication frequency and content analysis, I estimate we have less than 6 hours before they complete whatever contingency procedures they're implementing. Agent Kumar consulted with cyber specialists who were monitoring the criminals' technological systems for indicators of operational shutdown. Ms. Vasquez, we're seeing systematic deletion of digital files and deactivation of automated systems that suggest they're preparing to abandon their entire technological infrastructure. Elena understood that the next few hours would determine whether months of analytical work would result in successful prosecutions or sophisticated criminals escaping with millions of dollars and knowledge of federal investigative capabilities. Agent Kumar, if they're implementing shutdown procedures, they're probably also destroying evidence and preparing personnel for immediate dispersal. Agent Walsh activated emergency coordination protocols that would mobilize federal resources across multiple states for synchronized raids on criminal facilities Elena's analysis had identified. Ms. Vasquez, this is the culmination of everything your analytical work has built toward. In the next 6 hours, we'll either achieve one of the most successful financial crime investigations in Bureau history, or these criminals will escape with knowledge that could compromise federal investigative methods for years to come. Elena felt the weight of responsibility for operational outcomes that extended far beyond her original goal of stopping money laundering activity. Agent Walsh, I understand the stakes, and I'm prepared to provide whatever additional analytical support might be helpful during the final operational phase. As federal agents across 3 states prepared for coordinated raids based on Elena's intelligence, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from rejected FBI applicant to key consultant in a major federal investigation. The next few hours would determine whether her unconventional analytical methods could achieve the law enforcement impact she had dreamed of during her recruitment interviews 5 years earlier. The coordinated federal raids began at dawn across 3 states, with Elena monitoring the operations from the FBI command center in Phoenix, while field agents moved simultaneously against targets her analysis had identified. Assistant Director Torres stood behind her workstation, watching real-time video feeds from Utah, where agents were approaching an industrial complex that Elena's geographic profiling had pinpointed as the most likely command center location. "Breach, breach, breach," came the radio transmission from the Utah team leader as federal agents entered the facility. Elena watched her computer screens fill with transaction data and communication intercepts that confirmed what she had suspected for months. This wasn't just a money laundering operation, but a sophisticated criminal enterprise with technological capabilities that rivaled legitimate financial institutions. Agent Walsh coordinated communications between field teams while Elena provided real-time analysis of the evidence being discovered at the command center. Ms. Vasquez, Utah is reporting server farms, professional-grade network equipment, and workstations running custom financial processing software. This is exactly the kind of technological infrastructure your analysis predicted. Elena studied the live video feed from inside the criminal command center, feeling vindication mixed with amazement at the sophistication of the operation she had unraveled through months of patient analytical work. Agent Walsh, the scale of their technological investment explains how they were able to automate money laundering across hundreds of businesses simultaneously. This represents millions of dollars in criminal infrastructure. The arrests began within minutes as federal agents encountered criminal operatives who had been attempting to destroy evidence and abandon the facility. Elena watched field agents take into custody individuals whose communications she had been analyzing for weeks, finally seeing faces attached to the voices and digital signatures that had become familiar through her investigation. Agent Kumar was analyzing digital evidence that field teams were recovering from the command center computers. Ms. Vasquez, preliminary examination of their systems confirms everything your analysis indicated about their operational scope and methods. They were processing money for criminal organizations across the entire western United States, not just the 3 states we initially identified. Elena felt a surge of professional satisfaction as she realized that her investigation had uncovered criminal activity that exceeded even her own estimates of its scope and significance. Agent Kumar, if their operation extended beyond Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, the total amount of money they've laundered could be tens of millions of dollars, rather than the $12 million we initially calculated. Assistant Director Torres consulted with federal prosecutors who were coordinating with field teams to ensure that evidence collection met federal court standards. Ms. Vasquez, U.S. Attorney Chen, reports that we've recovered enough digital evidence to support prosecutions not only for money laundering but for racketeering, conspiracy, and operation of a continuing criminal enterprise. Your analysis has enabled us to dismantle an entire criminal organization. Elena continued monitoring financial systems to track the final resolution of the money laundering network her disruption had immobilized. Assistant Director Torres, our technological interventions have successfully trapped over $3 million in domestic accounts where federal seizure procedures can recover the money for victims. The criminals' attempt to accelerate their extraction ultimately worked in our favor by concentrating their assets in systems we could disrupt. Agent Walsh was coordinating with banking regulators who were implementing asset freezes based on Elena's financial intelligence. Ms. Vasquez, preliminary reports indicate that we'll be able to recover approximately 80% of the money stolen from businesses across the three-state area. That's an unprecedented recovery rate for a financial crime of this complexity. Elena watched the final phases of the coordinated raids, feeling a deep sense of closure as federal agents arrested individuals who had been stealing from small businesses for over a year. Agent Walsh, seeing these arrests validates every hour I spent analyzing transaction patterns and mapping network relationships. These criminals thought their sophistication made them untouchable, but their sophistication actually created the patterns that exposed them. Agent Kumar had been analyzing the criminal organization's digital files to understand how they had selected and compromised businesses for money laundering. Ms. Vasquez, their internal documentation confirms your assessment about their targeting methodology. They used sophisticated algorithms to identify businesses with specific operational characteristics that made them ideal for automated money laundering. Elena studied the criminal algorithmic targeting systems that federal agents had recovered, recognizing methodologies that paralleled her own analytical approaches but applied toward criminal rather than investigative purposes. Agent Kumar, this confirms that we were essentially fighting technology with technology. They used analytical methods to commit crimes, and we used analytical methods to stop them. Assistant Director Torres received updates from field teams who were completing evidence collection at multiple criminal facilities. Ms. Vasquez, our operation has resulted in 14 arrests across 3 states, seizure of over $3 million in criminal proceeds, and recovery of digital evidence that documents the entire structure and methodology of their criminal enterprise. Elena felt the profound satisfaction of knowing that her analytical work had directly led to justice for the small business owners who had been victimized by sophisticated criminals. Assistant Director Torres, this investigation began with one client whose catering business had been compromised. Now we've identified and arrested the entire criminal organization responsible for stealing from hundreds of businesses. Agent Walsh consulted with senior FBI leadership about the broader implications of Elena's analytical methods for future financial crime investigations. Ms. Vasquez, Bureau leadership is extremely interested in understanding how your independent analytical methods were able to identify and unravel a criminal operation that federal agencies had missed entirely. Elena had been anticipating this conversation since the investigation began, knowing that her unconventional background and methods would inevitably raise questions about federal investigative procedures. Agent Walsh, I think the key difference is that independent analysis isn't constrained by jurisdictional boundaries or institutional procedures. I could follow patterns wherever they led without worrying about which agency had responsibility for different aspects of the investigation. Agent Kumar looked up from the criminal digital systems he was analyzing. Ms. Vasquez, that's an important insight. These criminals designed their operation to exploit the seams between different law enforcement jurisdictions and federal agencies. Your analysis crossed all of those boundaries seamlessly. Elena nodded, recognizing that her investigation had succeeded partly because it wasn't limited by the organizational constraints that typically shaped federal law enforcement operations. Agent Kumar, criminals don't respect jurisdictional boundaries, so investigations that stop criminals sometimes need to cross those boundaries as well. Assistant Director Torres had been consulting with FBI leadership about Elena's role in future investigations. Ms. Vasquez, I want to discuss your professional plans beyond this investigation. Your analytical capabilities represent exactly the kind of expertise that federal agencies need for fighting sophisticated financial crimes. Elena felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension, as she contemplated possibilities she had barely allowed herself to imagine during her years of independent consulting. Assistant Director Torres, I'm certainly interested in discussing opportunities to continue using my analytical skills for federal law enforcement purposes. Agent Walsh had been coordinating with federal prosecutors who were beginning to prepare cases against the arrested criminal operatives. Ms. Vasquez, U.S. Attorney Chen wants to discuss your potential testimony in federal court. Your analysis will be crucial for explaining to juries how this criminal organization operated and how federal agents were able to identify and disrupt their activities. Elena understood that testifying in federal court would represent the ultimate validation of her analytical methods, but it would also expose her work to scrutiny by defense attorneys who would challenge every aspect of her investigation. Agent Walsh, I'm prepared to testify about my analysis and findings. My documentation is comprehensive enough to support detailed examination by court proceedings. Agent Kumar was analyzing the final data recovery from the Criminal Command Center systems. Ms. Vasquez, the evidence we've recovered confirms that your analysis was not only accurate but actually understated the scope of their criminal operation. They were laundering money for drug trafficking organizations, human trafficking networks, and international criminal syndicates. Elena felt a chill as she realized that her investigation had uncovered connections to criminal activities far more serious than financial fraud. Agent Kumar, that explains the sophisticated technology and operational security we observed. They weren't just laundering money, they were providing critical financial infrastructure for major criminal enterprises. Assistant Director Torres consulted with federal agencies beyond the FBI, who were interested in the criminal connections Elena's investigation had revealed. Ms. Vasquez, your analysis has provided intelligence that's valuable for ongoing investigations by DEA, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and international law enforcement agencies. This single investigation has generated leads for dozens of additional federal cases. Elena realized that her analytical work had accomplished far more than stopping a money laundering operation. It had provided federal law enforcement with intelligence about criminal networks that could impact investigations for years to come. Assistant Director Torres, I'm gratified that the investigation has provided value beyond the immediate case. Sophisticated financial crimes are often connected to other criminal activities. Agent Walsh had been coordinating with federal training divisions who were interested in incorporating Elena's analytical methods into federal agent education programs. Ms. Vasquez, the Bureau's training academy wants to understand how your pattern recognition techniques could be taught to federal agents who investigate financial crimes. Elena had never considered the possibility that her self-taught analytical methods could be formalized into training curricula for federal agents. Agent Walsh, I'd be honored to contribute to federal training programs. The techniques I use are primarily about patience, attention to detail, and systematic analysis of large datasets. Agent Kumar looked up from his evidence analysis with an expression of professional respect. Ms. Vasquez, I think you're understating your capabilities. What you call patience and attention to detail, we call genius-level analytical thinking applied to complex financial investigations. Elena felt a flush of pride at Kumar's assessment, remembering the FBI recruitment officer who had told her 5 years earlier that she lacked the assertive personality profile preferred for federal agents. Agent Kumar, I've learned that different kinds of investigations require different kinds of thinking. Complex financial crimes respond well to methodical analytical approaches. Assistant Director Torres had concluded his consultations with FBI senior leadership and returned his attention to Elena's future role in federal law enforcement. Ms. Vasquez, I'm authorized to offer you a position as a federal consultant specializing in complex financial crime analysis. The position would provide you with federal authority and resources, while allowing you to continue using the independent analytical methods that proved so effective in this investigation. Elena felt her heart racing as she absorbed Torres's offer, recognizing that he was proposing exactly the kind of federal law enforcement role she had dreamed of 5 years earlier. Assistant Director Torres, I'm extremely interested in that opportunity. Can you tell me more about what the position would involve? Agent Walsh smiled as she watched Elena's expression transform from professional satisfaction to genuine excitement. Ms. Vasquez, the consultant position would essentially formalize what you've been doing independently, but with federal authority, database access, and resources that would allow you to tackle cases at a scale you couldn't reach as an independent practitioner. Elena considered the implications of Walsh's description, imagining the investigative possibilities that would open up with federal resources supporting her analytical methods. Agent Walsh, that sounds like an ideal combination of independent analytical work with federal investigative capabilities. Agent Kumar had been listening to the job offer discussion while continuing his evidence analysis. Ms. Vasquez, I have to say that working with you on this investigation has been educational for me as well. Your approach to financial analysis has techniques that I plan to incorporate into my own investigative methods. Elena felt touched by Kumar's acknowledgement, recognizing that she had earned the professional respect of federal agents whose expertise she had long admired. Agent Kumar, working with federal cyber specialists, has taught me about technological capabilities I never could have accessed as an independent consultant. The combination of analytical methods and federal resources is more powerful than either approach alone. Assistant Director Torres consulted his notes about the consultant position parameters. Ms. Vasquez, the position would be based here in Phoenix but would involve investigations that could span multiple states and federal jurisdictions. You would essentially become the Bureau's specialist for complex financial crime analysis that crosses traditional jurisdictional boundaries. Elena realized that Torres was describing a role that would allow her to apply her analytical skills to exactly the kind of sophisticated criminal operations she had always wanted to fight. Assistant Director Torres, that position represents everything I hoped to accomplish when I first applied to join the FBI 5 years ago. Agent Walsh consulted her watch and began coordinating the transition from active operations to evidence processing and case preparation. Ms. Vasquez, while you're considering the consultant position, we have immediate work to complete in preparing this case for federal prosecution. Your continued involvement will be crucial for ensuring that our evidence meets court standards. Elena gathered her analytical materials, feeling the satisfaction of a complex investigation reaching successful resolution while also anticipating the professional opportunities that success had created. Agent Walsh, I'm committed to seeing this case through to successful prosecutions. These criminals need to face justice for the businesses they victimized. Agent Kumar was organizing the digital evidence that would support federal prosecutions against the criminal organization Elena had identified. Ms. Vasquez, your documentation and analysis will be the foundation for every aspect of our court cases. Defense attorneys will challenge our methods, but your evidence is comprehensive enough to withstand any scrutiny. Elena felt confident in her analytical work while also recognizing the responsibility that came with providing crucial evidence for federal prosecutions. Agent Kumar, I've maintained detailed documentation of every analytical step and conclusion because I knew that federal court proceedings would require that level of precision. As the command center began transitioning from active operations to case preparation, Elena reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred over the past weeks. She had entered the FBI building as a rejected applicant, trying to convince skeptical agents to investigate criminal activity she had discovered independently. She was leaving as a federal consultant whose analytical methods had enabled one of the most successful financial crime investigations in recent Bureau history. Assistant Director Torres approached Elena as she prepared to leave the command center. Ms. Vasquez, I want you to understand that your contribution to this investigation extends beyond just this single case. Your methods and insights have the potential to transform how federal agencies approach complex financial crime investigations. Elena felt humbled by Torres' assessment while also recognizing that her journey from rejection to federal consultant represented validation of analytical approaches that challenged conventional law enforcement thinking. Assistant Director Torres, I'm honored by your confidence and excited about the possibility of contributing to federal law enforcement at this level. Agent Walsh escorted Elena toward the elevator, carrying copies of evidence and documentation that Elena would need for continuing case preparation work. Ms. Vasquez, I have to admit that when you first contacted Agent Thornfield, none of us expected that a civilian consultant would end up teaching federal agents new approaches to financial crime investigation. Elena smiled as she remembered her initial phone call to Thornfield and his polite but dismissive response to her claims about a major money laundering operation. Agent Walsh, I think this investigation proved that effective law enforcement requires diverse perspectives and analytical approaches. Federal agents and independent consultants each bring valuable capabilities to complex investigations. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Elena considered how dramatically her professional life was about to change. The woman who had been told 5 years earlier that she wasn't FBI material was now being offered a federal position that would allow her to apply her analytical skills to the most sophisticated financial crimes in the country. Agent Walsh handed Elena her visitor badge as they reached the lobby security checkpoint. Ms. Vasquez, when you return tomorrow to continue case preparation work, you'll be entering as a federal consultant rather than a civilian visitor. That represents quite a transformation in a very short time. Elena walked toward the parking garage, reflecting on the investigation that had begun with one small business owner discovering suspicious transactions and had culminated in dismantling a multi-million-dollar criminal organization. Her analytical methods had not only stopped sophisticated criminals, but had earned her the professional recognition and federal authority she had sought for years. The next morning's newspaper would report the arrests and asset seizures that resulted from federal raids across 3 states. But the articles wouldn't mention the independent consultant whose patient analytical work had made the entire operation possible. Elena didn't mind the anonymity. She had learned that the most powerful accomplishments often happen behind the scenes, where careful analysis and persistent investigation gradually built cases that sophisticated criminals thought were impossible to solve. 5 years after being rejected by the FBI, Elena had proven that federal law enforcement needed exactly the kind of analytical thinking and methodical investigation that recruitment officers had dismissed as unsuitable for federal agents. Sometimes the most important qualifications weren't the ones that appeared on traditional assessment profiles, and sometimes the people who seemed least likely to succeed in federal roles were exactly the people who could revolutionize how federal investigations approached complex criminal problems. Elena started her car and drove toward her apartment, already planning the analytical work she would begin the next day as a federal consultant. The rejection that had once devastated her professional confidence had ultimately led her to develop independent capabilities that proved invaluable to the same agency that had once dismissed her potential. The FBI had finally discovered what Elena had always known, that fighting sophisticated criminals required sophisticated analysis, and sophisticated analysis required exactly the kind of patient, methodical, detail-oriented thinking that she had spent 5 years perfecting in her independent practice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.